We ended with Kant last class, which really closes out the period that's considered modern philosophy. And I know that's weird to think about, but maybe it's just because philosophers are a little ahead of the curve. So modernism for philosophy was the 16th through 18th centuries. It's just so weird to think about. So philosophers are already into postmodernism by the time we get to the 19th century in their thinking. It just took pop culture a while to catch up in the West. Like, it probably wasn't until the 50s and the beat movement, the beatniks and all that, leading into the hippies and yippies, where we really get postmodernism saturating American culture. But this was going on in Europe and Germany in the 1800s. Okay, so at least the thought part that was bring up. So we're going to start with Hegel today. And Hegel wanted this unified view of philosophy. He was kind of like a historical philosopher, but he realized in trying to explain the philosophers that came before him, he had to explain the medieval philosophers. And to understand the medieval, he had to understand the ancient. So he ends up working out this huge philosophy of history. And the first thing I want you to know about Hegel, even though I believe Kant, just like Thomas Aquinas, opened the windows to reason, and so we get this faith-reason mix going on in the latter part of the Middle Ages, taking us into the modern period. And then we see faith diminishing and reason growing in its power and influence in the philosophical systems of the West. But then when we get to Kant, he opens the door to this very Eastern type of thinking, even though he's so Western in his mindset, but he's not content with that Aristotelian law of non-contradiction, right? Or that the idea of correspondence theory of truth. He wanted a more inclusive idea of truth. And so the first thing to help you understand Hegel, all right, so with Hegel, he begins with this idea of the truth is the whole. And you need to keep coming back in your mind to this when we're talking about Hegel, because he's going to sound all over the road. At some points, he's going to sound like a materialist. At other times, he's going to sound like a theist. And at other times, he's going to sound like a pantheist. But you have to take his philosophy as a unified whole if you want to understand what he's getting at. Okay? And this is going to tie back in to, if you remember, John Scotus Erigena. And Plotinus. And the Neoplatonists. Plotinus, Neoplatonism. And so just real quick, because it's going to come up again, if you remember the Great Chain of Being, where we've got God, Demiurge. Yes, right on, thank you. No problem. God, the Demiurge, spirits, humans, and that weird horizon point. Animals, plants, minerals, all the way down to non-being or nothing. Okay, what's going to get freaky today is I'm going to teach you how everything and nothing is actually the same thing by definition. Okay. And we have Hegel to thank for this, but also John Scotus Erigena. So I want to go back to him a little bit, because I don't think I talked about his dialectic. Now, dialectic takes on a lot of different meanings in philosophy. When we go all the way back to Socrates, he had the dialectical method, which he was having a dialogue with people, right? He wasn't just this talking head lecturing at people, but they were going on a journey together where someone would claim to know something, Socrates would have follow-up questions, and they would have this dialogue. Well, I have a very dialectic mind. I don't even need another person to have a conversation with. Whenever I hear something or I'm exposed to some new idea or concept, automatically my mind will take that proposition and I'll look at its antithesis or its opposite. And I'll try to wrestle these two ideas or concepts in my head, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. But the goal isn't just to paralyze myself with conflicting thoughts, but to find a synthesis between the two. And this is the kind of dialectic that John Scotus was doing. And part of what he was trying to get across was, we can posit things like God is love. What would the antithesis of God is love be? Or the antithesis?
God is not love.
Yeah, God is not love. John Scotus would say both of these statements are equally true and not true at the same time. And what he means by that is, this human word of love can in no way encapsulate what it means that God is love. Okay? So it's just as accurate to say God is not love, if we're talking about human love, as it is to talk about God is love, which is all of human love and beyond. So his synthesis between the thesis and the antithesis is God is supra love. Or you could say beyond love. But if we go back to Hegel, Hegel would be very fine with this. In fact, I think he should have given this guy some credit, this 9th century Irish monk. But Hegel simply saying, the truth is the whole. You have to take all of these different movements together in their totality. What Scotus is trying to do is to point the otherworldliness, the holiness of God. But if you remember, for him, God is at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, right? It's that which creates and is not created is the same as that which is not created and does not create. Fascinating, at least in Scotus's mind. Hegel takes this idea of the dialectic and he applies it to philosophy and metaphysics. In fact, this very concept of Geist, which is German for spirit, and he really believes history is the story of Geist moving through human affairs and what we have become made aware of. And so for Hegel, he starts with this thesis of non-being. And we'll posit this with everything, or all being. You could say nothing. Okay, I'm not going to write this down. I'm going to say it slowly for you, though. By definition, nothing is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if I could add something to nothing, it wouldn't be nothing anymore. And if I could take something away from nothing, it wouldn't have been nothing to begin with. Okay, got it?
Correct.
Now wait for it. Everything is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if you add something to everything, it wasn't everything. And if you take something away from everything, it's not everything anymore. So by definition, everything and nothing have the same definition. That of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. And what is the synthesis between everything and nothing? What's in between everything and nothing?
All things.
No, that's everything.
Something.
Something. Because something ain't nothing, but it sure isn't everything. Yeah. So it's in between these movements. And Hegel would say the truth is the whole. Nothing, everything, and something. And this is how he sees the Spirit of God moving from absolute non-being, or you could even say pure being, it doesn't matter, into everything we know and see and experience in the world. But it starts with God's Spirit coming into this space-time continuum and then unfolding through human events. And so he begins with this idea of like desire. And out of this nothingness, this void, this vastness, we have the inklings of desire beginning, almost like tendrils or roots coming out of the abyss, out of the chaos. And this comes into the earliest civilizations, which he would see as like savage, barbaric. He would liken this to like tribal religions or political systems, or even like the despotic views in the East, where you would have maybe like god kings or these sorts of things. And he believes out of this process, Geist manifests itself into the world, or the Spirit of God, if you prefer, is manifesting itself into the world until it gets to the Greek materialist. But the problem with the Greeks, as we already noticed, was they were so good at looking at and evaluating this physical material world that they confused the physical material world with God himself. But when the fullness of time had come, Christ enters into the scene, and now we have this Spirit, or Geist, manifesting itself in the person of Jesus the Christ. And for the first time in cosmic history, God can know himself. And you might say, wait a second, this is the omniscient being? This is the first time he can know himself? I'm speaking in human linear terms here, not in eternity. But in this space-time continuum, it took the incarnation for God to be able to look back from history to know himself, and know himself in the incarnation. And then from that point on, any human that so had the Spirit of Christ in them could participate in this movement of Geist through human history. Yeah, we had things like inquisitions and people burned at the stakes, little thorns along the way, but this finally ends with German romanticism. And I don't mean romanticism like a Harlequin romance novel. I mean people who have looked at the world and they say it is not enough. There's something beyond the physical, material reality. There's also a spiritual dimension. And that's what this German transcendental idealism was into. Yes, there's a real concrete physical world like Kant is positing, but we are bringing something to it. But it's not just us. The very Spirit of God is shaping and forming history. And so Hegel is saying it takes this transcendental philosophy to actually understand for the first time, because the problem with Christianity, it's all dealing in metaphors. For example, and I know this is going to sound a little blasphemous to you all. I don't mean it that way. I don't think Hegel meant that way. He saw himself as a devout Lutheran. But this idea of God as our Father, is that literal, physical, material? Or is that a metaphor? Is that a figure of speech to explain our relationship? I mean, and I don't want to be crude, but God did not seed us in a physical, material sense. Although if you look at 1 John 3:9, it sure does imply that our new life comes from the very seed of God. But we'll talk about that later. We're not there yet. So this idea that Christianity is great and wonderful and it tells us the truth of God, but it's so wrapped in metaphor, symbolism, analogy, that we need philosophy to show us actually what's happening. And we get beyond the physicalism, we get beyond the pictures, and we're coming out of the cave, basically, walking in the full light of day. So basically, like John Scotus before him, Hegel is basically saying it is philosophy that opens the heavens, right? Not religion, not the Greek materialism, the sciences, but philosophy itself. And then with this, we come to the full budding of Western thought. Make some petals here. This full bloom of Western thought. But what happens after the bloom? Anyways, in this bloom, humanity is self-realized, and we realized who we are in God and that we are part of God's movement. But this is the cosmic loop piece, because once we have this God realization or consciousness, or that we have been knit together with the Godhead, it loops back into itself because now we are one with the Spirit, one with the Geist. And so we become part of this process or this cosmic loop of God moving through history. That's my little cosmic loop dance, right? Where it's just this incessant flow in like that torus shape of everything moving and flowing, etc. Any questions on this? So, God being the Alpha and the Omega and everything in between, but it's not a linear line. It's like a cosmic, self-perpetuating loop with no beginning and no end, world without end. What happens after the bloom normally in a plant? What does the bloom turn into? Okay, pollination, then what happens to the flower?
Yeah, decays.
Not yet. Something else happens. I know I'm not living in an agrarian culture here.
I think it's fertile.
Yeah.
Yes, and the flower produces fruit, which is, what's the fruit of the flower? Seeds. Seeds, okay, you get rose hips, right? The roses turn into rose hips, and if you open up the rose hips, it contains the seeds. And personally, I think this is what happened. Rather than us coming to total self-consciousness or God awareness or what, however you want to phrase it, after this German Enlightenment period, I feel like it went back to seed. And so we have this great blooming and flowering, but contained within this become the seeds of the future. And I'm gonna highlight two of these seeds for the remainder of this journey because I think they're still the two dominant philosophies. They definitely were of the 20th century, and moving into the 21st century, we can still kind of see them acting out. And the first of these seeds I want to start with comes from Karl Marx.